The first sound Eleanor Whitaker heard that morning was not the wind. And in northern Maine, in late January, that was saying something. The wind usually owned the dawn, rattling the old window panes of her cedar cabin, prowling across the frozen lake like a restless animal. But on this particular morning, at 80 years old and long accustomed to the language of winter, Eleanor woke to a different noise. A heavy thud, then another. Slow, dragging, desperate. She sat up in her narrow bed, heart tapping against her ribs. The fire in the stove had burned low, and frost had traced delicate white veins along the inside of the glass. For a moment she wondered if she had dreamed it. Then came a long, shuddering exhale from just beyond her front door. Not wind, breath. Eleanor pulled on her wool robe and wrapped her late husband's flannel scarf around her neck. She didn't reach for the phone. There was no one close enough to call, and she didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the lantern. When she opened the door, the cold cut through her like a blade. And there they were. A full-grown cow moose lay collapsed against her porch steps, sides heaving in shallow, frantic pulls. One massive leg was bent awkwardly beneath her. Her dark eyes, rimmed with frost, flicked toward Eleanor with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. Curled against her flank, barely moving, was a calf, too small for this kind of winter, its fur clumped with ice, its tiny chest rising and falling like it wasn't sure it wanted to continue. For a long moment, the world narrowed to the three of them. Eleanor felt the old instinct rise in her chest, the one that had carried her through 80 winters, through raising 2 sons, through burying a husband, through losing neighbors and gaining new ones. The instinct that said, when something is suffering at your door, you do not turn it away. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. The cow moose tried to rise when Eleanor stepped forward, but her front legs buckled. A low groan vibrated from her throat. Eleanor crouched slowly, speaking in the soft tone she once used for frightened horses on her father's farm. "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm not here to hurt you." She could see it now, a deep gash along the moose's hind leg, likely from slipping on ice or tangling with barbed wire near one of the distant logging roads. The wound was crusted with frozen blood. Infection had set in. The animal had probably been wandering for days, weakened, starving, desperate, and somehow, through instinct or miracle, she had come to Eleanor's door. The nearest wildlife rescue was over an hour away on clear roads, longer in a storm like this. Eleanor doubted they could reach her before nightfall, and she doubted the moose had that long. The calf made a thin, broken bleat. That sound decided it. Eleanor stood, her knees protesting, and moved with surprising speed for her age. She hauled open the barn doors and laid down thick straw near the entrance. Then she returned to the porch. "I need you to trust me," she murmured, though she knew trust between wild and human was a fragile, unlikely thing. She fetched an old wooden sled from the side of the house. It had once carried her boys down snowy hills, their laughter ringing across the fields. Now it would carry something heavier. The cow moose's eyes followed her every movement. Fear, pain, exhaustion. Eleanor slid the sled alongside the injured leg. She didn't try to lift the animal. That would have been impossible, but she used the sled as leverage, gently maneuvering, inch by inch, guiding the moose's weight onto the straw path she had made. It took nearly 40 minutes. 40 minutes of breath fogging the air, of Eleanor's gloved hands steady and patient, of whispered encouragement. 40 minutes of the calf nuzzling its mother's neck as if willing her to stand. Finally, through sheer will and careful positioning, the cow staggered upright for just long enough to limp, dragging, shaking, into the barn. When they were inside, Eleanor shut the doors against the wind. The barn smelled of hay and memory. It had not housed animals in years, not since arthritis had claimed her hands too fiercely for daily chores. But it was dry, sheltered, safe. The moose collapsed again onto the straw, this time without the violence of the porch. Eleanor knelt beside her, breathless. "Well," she said softly, brushing frost from the calf's ears, "looks like I've got company." The next hours blurred into a rhythm Eleanor hadn't felt in years. Boiling water on the stove, gathering old medical supplies she had kept from when her husband tended livestock, mixing salt and warm water to clean the wound, talking constantly, gently, so the animals would know her voice meant no harm. The cow moose flinched when Eleanor first touched the injured leg, but exhaustion dulled resistance. And there was something else in her eyes now. Not quite trust, but no longer panic. The wound was worse than Eleanor thought. Swollen, angry, but not beyond hope. She cleaned it carefully, murmuring apologies when the moose shuddered. She wrapped it with clean cloth torn from old cotton sheets. "You're tougher than you think," she whispered. By nightfall, the storm intensified. Snow battered the barn roof in relentless waves. Inside, Eleanor set up a small space heater she rarely used, positioning it safely away from straw. She brought buckets of water and what hay she had left. It wasn't much, but it was something. The calf finally stood on shaky legs and nosed Eleanor's coat pocket. She laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. "I suppose you're hungry too." She warmed milk substitute she once kept for orphaned kittens and offered what she could in a shallow pan. The calf drank clumsily but eagerly. Hours passed. Eleanor's body ached. Her fingers throbbed, but she stayed seated in the straw, back against a wooden beam, watching over them. Around midnight, when the wind howled hardest, she felt something brush her shoulder. The calf had curled beside her, not against its mother, against her. Eleanor froze, tears pricking her eyes. It had been 6 years since anyone leaned on her for warmth. She rested her hand gently on the calf's neck. The mother moose watched, but did not protest. In the quiet of that barn, something shifted inside Eleanor. A loneliness she had carried like an invisible coat loosened slightly. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel like the last living soul on this patch of earth. Morning came pale and blue. The storm had passed. The cow moose was still breathing, stronger, her eyes clearer. Eleanor stepped outside to assess the road and found tire tracks cutting through fresh snow. Within an hour, a wildlife rescue truck arrived. Apparently, her neighbor 10 miles down had spotted moose tracks leading toward her property and grown concerned. He'd called authorities before the storm worsened. 2 young wildlife officers stepped into the barn and stopped short at the sight. "Well, I'll be," one whispered. Eleanor stood slowly, brushing straw from her robe. She came to the door. Eleanor explained simply. Seemed wrong not to answer. The officers examined the wound and nodded in approval at her careful cleaning and wrapping. "You likely saved her life," the older one said. Another night in that storm, she wouldn't have made it. They prepared a transport trailer, gently guiding the mother and calf inside. The cow limped but stood. The calf walked without wobbling. Before they closed the trailer, something unexpected happened. The calf turned. It walked back down the ramp and stood directly in front of Eleanor. For a heartbeat, the barn held its breath. The calf pressed its forehead lightly against Eleanor's chest. Not hard, not frantic, just a quiet, deliberate touch. Then it turned and returned to its mother. Eleanor stood there long after the truck disappeared down the road, the snow sparkling in the clean morning sun. Weeks passed. Winter softened. Snow melted into rivulets that traced silver lines through the forest. Eleanor resumed her quiet routines, chopping small stacks of wood, knitting by the stove, waving at the rare passing truck. But something had changed. People started stopping by. The wildlife officers had shared her story in town. Then someone posted it online. Then a local news station came with cameras. They called her brave. She laughed at that. "I just opened my door," she told them. But neighbors began bringing casseroles. A high school class wrote her letters about kindness. A little girl mailed her a drawing of a moose with a halo. The barn, once silent, filled occasionally with visitors wanting to see where it happened. Eleanor found herself telling the story not as a tale of heroism, but as a reminder. "Compassion isn't complicated," she would say, hands folded in her lap. "When something broken shows up at your door, you help if you can. That's all." In early spring, as the first green shoots pushed through thawed earth, Eleanor was sitting on her porch with a cup of tea when she saw movement at the tree line. Her breath caught. 2 shapes emerged from the forest. The cow moose, thinner but healed, stepped cautiously into the clearing. Beside her, taller now, stronger, was the calf. They did not approach the house this time. They simply stood at the edge of the trees, watching. Eleanor set her cup down slowly and rose. "Well," she whispered. The calf took a few tentative steps forward, then stopped. The mother remained still, calm. They stayed only a minute. Long enough. Then they turned and disappeared back into the forest. Eleanor felt no sadness as she watched them go. Only fullness. She understood something now that she hadn't fully grasped before that winter morning. We do not help because it guarantees gratitude. We do not open doors because we expect something in return. We do it because compassion is what keeps the cold from claiming us entirely. That night, Eleanor lit a small candle in her window, not as a signal, not as a call, but as a quiet promise. If something broken ever found its way to her doorstep again, human or animal, she would answer. And in a world that often feels frozen with fear and distance, sometimes all it takes to thaw it is one door opening in the cold.